Today we're going to talk about Kolob.
And why is Kolob an interesting subject? Because you take it away.
I think that the topic of Kolob has always been something that's super interesting, but especially in the last few years, the Book of Mormon musical came out, and there's a line in that show that says, "I believe that God lives on a planet called Kolob."
So we look insane,
Right.
So what is Kolob, and do Mormons actually believe that God lives there?
I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the Serial Mormon History Podcast. The Book of Abraham may be an obscure piece of Mormon canon, but it holds some pieces of doctrine and theology which set Mormonism apart from other Protestant sects of Christianity. It's been interesting. The Book of Abraham is a tough subject to study from the chapel attender's perspective without getting lost down the rabbit hole of apologetics. There aren't any general conference talks that I could find about it. There are plenty of apologists talking and writing and making videos about the Book of Abraham, but very little by way of official releases. That intro clip you just heard was from the YouTube channel 3 Mormons, which is a few millennials talking about issues within the church, and it's funded by the church, but even 3 Mormons isn't official church statement. The Book of Abraham is tough to nail down. Today we continue our 3-part examination of the Book of Abraham. Part 1 was the physical, tracking the papyri collection and the cultural milieu which brought Egyptology to prominence in Western cultures. For Part 2, today, we're going to examine the spiritual aspect of the book to see exactly what Mormon doctrine and theology comes specifically from the claimed papyri pages that the church purchased from the Egyptian antiquities dealer Michael Chandler in July of 1835. We're going to be reading a number of extracts from the Book of Abraham and using LDS-approved study guides to try and garner an understanding of how Mormon doctrine evolved once this book was quote-unquote translated and printed in March of 1842 in Nauvoo, Illinois. If you're looking for the slam dunk arguments which prove the Book of Abraham to be false, you're going to have to tune into next week's episode when we go through the logical aspect of the Book of Abraham. We're just focusing on the spiritual and doctrinal side of the book for today. So let's dive right in. The introduction from the online version of the Book of Abraham says the following, quote, "A translation of some ancient records that have fallen into our hands from the catacombs of Egypt, purporting to be the writings of Abraham while he was in Egypt, called the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand upon papyrus," end quote. And that purporting to be part was actually removed in the 1878. That's the second edition of the Book of Abraham, but we discussed that and the resulting effects last episode. Anyone who reads through the Book of Abraham will find it sounds awfully similar to another Book of Mormon scripture, Genesis. In fact, the majority of the Book of Abraham is merely a rewriting and interpolation of Genesis in many ways. Now, to be clear, this book claims to be written by Abraham himself, but no writing by Abraham actually exists. What we know of Abraham's life and timeline comes from the authors of the Pentateuch, where he's featured as a descendant of Adam and Eve, born in Ur, or present-day Muhir, Iraq. I guess that's how you say that. Now, Enoch, of course, descended from Adam and Noah, and the flood followed Enoch, and the Tower of Babel came soon after that, which all preceded Father Abraham. So according to Genesis, with absolutely no contemporary records to verify this, Abraham was supposedly born around 2000 BCE, and was the father of Isaac, who he nearly sacrificed on the altar, and the grandfather of Jacob, who became Israel. All of that happens within the first 40 chapters of the book of Genesis. It's worth noting, these dates are only internally consistent, and the majority of them were ascribed during the early Enlightenment period by Archbishop Ussher. That means nearly all of the events that I just described from the Bible only happen in the Bible, which began as early Hebrew oral traditions. Around the purported time of Solomon's Temple in 1000 BCE, that's when some contemporary evidence of some of the biblical people and events actually come into play from non-Bible author sources, and many of the claimed dates are wildly inaccurate and falsifiable by these contemporary sources. If one were to assert that all of the people in Genesis are merely legends and myths, another person would be at extreme pains to disprove such a claim from any other source than the Bible itself. With that said, we are ignoring the discussion of biblical accuracy today in order to understand the contents of the Book of Abraham in context. It's really just a nesting doll of religious fiction as a rewriting of a religious text. So chapter 1 of the Book of Abraham begins with this, quote, "In the land of the Chaldeans, at the residence of my father, I, Abraham, saw that it was needful for me to obtain another place of residence, and finding there was greater happiness and peace and rest for me, I sought for the blessings of the fathers, and the right whereunto I should be ordained to administer the same. Having been myself a follower of righteousness, desiring also to be one who possessed great knowledge, and to be a greater follower of righteousness, and to possess a greater knowledge, and to be a father of many nations, a prince of peace, and desiring to receive instructions, and to keep the commandments of God, I became a rightful heir, a high priest, holding the right belonging to the fathers. It was conferred upon me from the fathers. It came down from the fathers, from the beginning of time, yea, even from the beginning, or before the foundations of the earth to the present time, even the right of the firstborn on the first man, who is Adam, or first father, through the fathers unto me. I sought for mine appointment unto the priesthood according to the appointment of God unto the fathers concerning the seed." End quote. This is coded language, referring to what was known as the Melchizedek priesthood. That is the right of the fathers given to the first father Adam, the Melchizedek priesthood, passed down from one father to the next, unto Abraham. These labels that Abraham claims for himself, the Prince of Peace, the Father of many nations, etc., those are all ascribed to him long after his supposed death by the Hebrews. Him ascribing those labels to himself would be like Einstein calling himself the greatest physicist who ever lived while he was in his teens. It just doesn't make sense. It's an anachronism. Chapter 1 continues to describe what the land of Egypt was like religiously at the time. Archaeologists note Egypt as a paganistic society, but paganism has essentially become a catch-all term for most mysterious religions which predate monotheism. Abraham says this, quote, "My fathers having turned from their righteousness, and from the holy commandments which the Lord their God had given unto them, unto the worshipping of the gods of the heathens, utterly refused to hearken to my voice. For their hearts were set to do evil, and they were wholly turned to the god of Elkanah, and the god of Limnah, and the god of Mamachra, and the god of Korash, and the god of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Therefore they turned their hearts to the sacrifice of the heathen, in offering up their children unto their dumb idols, and hearkened not unto my voice, but endeavored to take away my life by the hand of the priest of Elkanah. The priest of Elkanah was also the priest of Pharaoh. Now at this time it was the custom of the priest of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to offer upon the altar which was built in the land of Chaldea for the offering unto these strange gods, both men, women, and children. And it came to pass that the priest made an offering unto the god of Pharaoh, and also unto the god of Shagreel, even after the manner of the Egyptians. Now the god of Shagreel was the sun. Even the thank offering of a child did the priest of Pharaoh offer upon the altar which stood by the hill called Potiphar's Hill, at the head of the plain of Olishem." End quote. Okay, all of these names don't map to anything that Egyptians would have called their gods and priests. These are just manufactured out of Joseph's mind. For lack of a better source, they must necessarily have been dreamt up in the mind of Joseph Smith. There are some Greek and Hebrew sounding syllables in there, but the names Joe put into Abraham's writing are unrecognizable to sounding anything like any specific language. These names are crucial, however, when it comes to Joseph's quote-unquote translation of the papyri. Facsimile 1 is the iconic picture of a human figure laying down on the lion table, which Joe called an altar, with a standing priest holding up a knife to the lying down figure. There's also a bird hovering over the head of the figure lying on the altar, which is also explained in the Book of Abraham. This entire scene depicted in the papyri of Facsimile 1 is described in the following passage. Quote, "Now this priest had offered upon this altar 3 virgins at one time, who were the daughters of Onita, one of the royal descent, directly from the loins of Ham. These virgins were offered up because of their virtue. They would not bow down to worship gods of wood or of stone. Therefore they were killed upon this altar, and it was done after the manner of the Egyptians. And it came to pass that the priests laid violence upon me, that they might slay me, also as they did those virgins upon this altar. And that you might have a knowledge of this altar, I will refer you to the representation at the commencement of this record." facsimile 1. It was made after the form of a bedstead, such as was had among the Chaldeans, and it stood before the gods of Elkanah, Libnah, Mamakra, Korash, and also a god like unto the Pharaoh, king of Egypt. That you may have an understanding of these gods, I have given you the fashion of them in the figures at the beginning, which manner of the figures is called by the Chaldeans Ralinios, which signifies hieroglyphics. Ralinios, because why not? These are all made-up names. Why not just make up more crazy ones? And as they lifted up their hands upon me, that they might offer me up and take away my life, behold, I lifted up my voice unto the Lord my God, and the Lord hearkened and heard, and he filled me with a vision of the Almighty, and the angel of his presence stood by me, and immediately unloosed my bands. Isn't unloosed also tightening? You loose bands, you don't unloose them. Anyway, and his voice was unto me, Abram, Abram, behold, my name is Jehovah, and I have heard thee, and have come down to deliver thee, and to take thee away from thy father's house, and from all thy kinfolks, into a strange land which thou knowest not of. End quote. So we just need to pause here for a brief moment, because the hieroglyphic that is depicted in facsimile 1 and the picture that is attained by it is the sacrifice, the claimed sacrifice of Abraham by this priest of Elkanah. That's, of course, the figures laying down and the figure standing over him with a knife. That is what is supposedly depicted, printed in the Book of Abraham. But human sacrifice in Egypt is really hard to document. That's not saying that it didn't happen, but merely that it's hard to prove the circumstances by which human sacrifice was performed. By the logic, or lack thereof, provided in the Book of Abraham, Abraham removed himself unto Egypt and then consequently suffered some kind of religious persecution, which led him to being a sacrificial lamb on the altar that's shaped like a lion. However, modern Egyptology can really only document two types of human sacrifice, and they seem to be rather rare in occurrence. From Human Sacrifice in Ancient Egypt by Caroline Seawright, citing Jackie Kinnear, quote, human sacrifice is not generally connected with ancient Egypt. There is little evidence of human sacrifice during most of the dynastic period of ancient Egypt. And the dynastic period begins in about 3000 BCE, just to let you know. But there is some evidence that it may have been practiced in the Nile Valley during the first dynasty and possibly also pre-dynastic Egypt. The earliest known example of human sacrifice may perhaps be found in pre-dynastic burials in the south of Egypt, dated to the Naqada second period. One of the discovered bodies showed marks of the throat from having been cut before having been decapitated. The two definitions of human sacrifice that could be applied to the very early development of ancient Egypt are, 1. The ritual killing of human beings as part of the offerings presented to the gods on a regular basis or on special occasions, and 2. Retainer sacrifice, or the killing of domestic servants to bury them along with their master. That is from Human Sacrifice by Jackie Kinnear. End quote. So this extremely bold assertion that Abraham was laid up to be sacrificed by the ancient Egyptians, this priest of the god Elkanah, there's not really any foundation for that. That does seem to be a bit of an aberration in comparison to how human sacrifices may have been practiced in Egypt, or at least are documentable to having been practiced in Egypt. However, it does descend from facsimile 1. We can't get away from that. So after that, the Book of Abraham goes on to discuss how the foundation of Egypt was established as such an idolatrous paganistic culture of hedonism. Turns out it's because of racism. Quote, now this king of Egypt was a descendant from the loins of Ham, and was a partaker of the blood of the Canaanites by birth. From this descent sprang all the Egyptians, and thus the blood of the Canaanites was preserved in the land. The land of Egypt being first discovered by a woman who was the daughter of Ham, and the daughter of Egyptus, which in the Chaldea signifies Egypt, which signifies that which is forbidden. When this woman discovered the land, it was under water, who afterwards settled her sons in it, and thus from Ham sprang that race which preserved the curse in the land. Pharaoh, being a righteous man, established his kingdom and judged his people wisely and justly all his days. Which Pharaoh, right? Seeking earnestly to imitate that order established by the fathers in the first generations in the days of the first patriarchal reign, and even in the reign of Adam and also Noah his father, who blessed him with the blessings of the earth and with the blessings of wisdom, but cursed him as pertaining to the priesthood. Cursed him pertaining to the priesthood. Verse 8. Now Pharaoh being of that lineage of the Canaanites, by which he could not have the right of priesthood. End quote. What, one may ask, was the curse that caused Pharaoh to not be able to hold the priesthood, and all subsequent generations of descendants of Ham to have this same priesthood ban? Well, the Book of Mormon is nice enough to articulate it for us in extensive detail. This is from Alma chapter 3, verse 6, quote, "And the skins of the Lamanites were dark, according to the mark which was set upon their fathers, which was a curse upon them because of their transgressions and their rebellion against their brethren, who consisted of Nephi, Jacob, and Joseph, and Sam, who were just and holy men. And their brethren sought to destroy them. Therefore they were cursed, and the Lord set upon them a mark, yea, upon Laman and Lemuel, and also the sons of Ishmael and the Ishmaelitish women. And this was done that their seed might be distinguished from the seed of their brethren, that thereby the Lord God might preserve his people, that they might not mix and believe in incorrect traditions, which would prove their destruction." That they might not mix. Interracial marriage. We can't have that. "And it came to pass that whosoever did mingle his seed with that of the Lamanites did bring the same curse upon his seed. Therefore whosoever suffered himself to be led away by the Lamanites was called under that head, and there was a mark set upon him. Now we will return again to the Amalekites, for they also had a mark set upon them. Yea, they set the mark upon themselves, yea, even a mark of red upon their foreheads. Thus the word of God is fulfilled, for these are the words which he said unto Nephi, Behold, the Lamanites have I cursed, and I will set a mark on them, that they and their seed may be separated from thee and thy seed." Segregation. "From this time henceforth, except they repent of their wickedness and turn to me, that I may have mercy upon them. And again I will set a mark upon him that mingleth his seed with thy brethren, that they may be cursed also. And again I will set a mark upon him that fighteth against thee and thy seed." End quote. That mark, that is dark skin. There's no way around that. And that was Joseph's theology coming out of 1829. That's the Book of Mormon. That's when it was written. His theology evolved and developed through early 1830 as he began his Bible revision, which started to be published in 1832 with the Book of Moses, which was also canonized into the Pearl of Great Price with these passages. Quote, "The people of Canaan shall divide themselves in the land shall be barren and unfruitful, and none other people shall dwell there but the people of Canaan. For behold, the Lord shall curse the land with much heat, and the barrenness thereof shall go forth forever. And there was a blackness come upon the children of Canaan, that they were despised among all people." A blackness come upon the children of Canaan. It continues later on. "Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem and Canaan, shall be his servant, and a veil of darkness shall cover him, that he shall be known among all men. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem and Canaan, shall be his servant." End quote. And my apologies for stumbling through that, because I'm reading the originals of all of these with no punctuation whatsoever. So, when you read from the Joseph Smith papers, the original dictations of Joseph Smith, it's a mess. It's nothing like the revised and spiffied up version that you find in the actual canon of the church today. Anyway, people will often claim that Joseph was progressive, considering that he ordained a black man, Elijah Abel, into the priesthood. It was Brigham Young who applied the curse of Cain to all black people and barred them from getting the priesthood. Well, Joseph, like everybody in all of the history of all humanity, was a product of his time and culture. And all of these are doctrines which came from him. We have the Book of Mormon from 1829 with its racism, the Book of Moses from 1832 with its racism, and the Book of Abraham in 1842 with its racism. It's really interesting. And by the way, by contemporary accounts, Elijah Abel, that first black man who was given the priesthood, was actually rather white and delightsome compared to other African Americans. The simple fact that Joe ordained someone his generation would call a quote-unquote mulatto to the priesthood may be evidence of his profoundly racist ideas of righteousness being tied to skin color than it is a testament to Joseph's progressiveness. If he saw this black man who has fairly light skin, he might think, oh, he must be righteous. Let's give him the priesthood. It may just be a more horrific version of Joseph's racism coming into play. But that's just a different perspective worth consideration. That's all. It should also be noted that Joe mislabeled one of the dark-skinned priests in facsimile 3 to be a slave. The priest was, in the papyri itself, by Egyptological standards, the black-skinned person there that was documented in the papyri, they were a priest, but Joseph labeled them to be a slave. It seems reminiscent of his own views of people of color's role in 19th century American society. So, to reiterate, the purposes of our examination of the Book of Abraham on the spiritual front today are to see what doctrine and theology specifically derived from it. And we're not even through the first half of the first chapter. The spiritual side of the Book of Abraham is much deeper than could be stated in an audio format like this. Let's continue our examination by moving on into chapter 2. One last point of consideration before moving on. The introduction of the original 1842 printing of the Book of Abraham included facsimile 1, which I described as Abraham lying on the table to be sacrificed by that idolatrous priest of Elkanah. Not only was this papyrus inaccurately interpolated by Joseph Smith when he pasted it to a thick piece of paper and drew his sketch of what he thought the completed papyrus should look like, but it was also used to translate the contents of at least the first chapter of the Book of Abraham. The reading that we have done describes and contextualizes facsimile 1, and the original printing contained explanation of the above cut with a translation of the image with all of the names listed. So it simply cannot be proven that the Book of Abraham was not, quote-unquote, translated from facsimile 1. That is something to just keep in mind, especially as we get into next week's episode. So chapter 2 contains this heading in the modern-day Book of Abraham from LDS.org, quote, Abraham leaves Ur to go to Canaan. Jehovah appears to him at Haran. All gospel blessings are promised to his seed, and through his seed to all. He goes to Canaan and on to Egypt, end quote. This chapter goes on to describe Abraham taking Sarai to wife, his brother Nahor taking Milcah to wife. Abraham, along with his nephew Lot and all their wives, went from Ur of the Chaldees to Canaan. After that, Jehovah once again appears to Abraham and tells him that he and his family will depart Haran. Jehovah talks about how awesome he is, knowing the end from the beginning and all of everything in the universe, and the earth is his footstool, etc., all of these things. Just go read it for yourself. After Jehovah departs from Abraham, he says that he knows that God is super real for this time because he appeared face to face with Abraham and also saved him from being slain in Egypt by the idolatrous priest Elkanah. After that, Abraham and his family and newly acquired followers went from Haran to Jershon, to the land of Shechem, to Moreh, and finally to Canaan before deciding to go back to Egypt because the famine was too great. Abraham built multiple altars all along the way and had a few more visionary experiences with the Lord, during one of which the Lord tells Abraham that Sarai was too beautiful to go into Egypt as his wife, and that he should tell everybody that she is his sister, or else the Egyptians would kill him and steal her away. I'm not really sure how that works logistically. The justification is that the Egyptians would vie for Abraham's favor if they thought Sarai was his sister and, that he could give her away in marriage, instead of having her for himself to be stolen by the idolatrous Egyptians, if she was his wife. But I'm not exactly sure how to, interpret this logistically speaking. So that's a very brief synopsis of chapter 2. Chapter 3 gets pretty fun, and chapter 3 is actually extremely crucial to deeper Mormon doctrine. This is truly one of the pearls inside of this book for everything contained therein. It begins with Abraham possessing the Urim and Thummim. Urim and Thummim, depends on where you come from. It should be noted before proceeding that Joe and friends used the phrase Urim and Thummim in ways that ancient Hebrews never did. So the Hebrew priests used the stones where Urim and Thummim translate to light and perfection in order to basically divine the future by casting them on the ground. Whichever way they landed designated specific outcomes of whatever they were trying to divine from the universe. Joe and friends used the term Urim and Thummim as a catch-all phrase for any seer stone used in any capacity of scrying or divining. Joe putting, precious into Mr. Hat and then staring into the darkness was how he used the Urim and Thummim, and it could be reasonably assumed that this is the way that Joe interpreted Abraham using the same implements, not in the way that the Hebrew priests actually used such stones. So, from chapter 3, quote, And I, Abraham, had the Urim and Thummim, which the Lord my God had given unto me, in Ur of the Chaldees. And I saw the stars, also that they were very great, and that one of them was nearest unto the throne of God. And there were many great ones which were near unto it. And the Lord said unto me, These are the governing ones, the planets, of course. And the name of the great one is Kolob, because it is near unto me. For I am the Lord thy God. I have set this one to govern all those which belong to the same order of that upon which thou standest, meaning the earth. And the Lord said unto me by the Urim and Thummim that Kolob was after the manner of the Lord, according to its times and seasons in the revolutions thereof. That one revolution was a day unto the Lord, after his manner of reckoning, it being 1,000 years according to the time appointed unto that whereon thou standest. This is the reckoning of the Lord's time, according to the reckoning of Kolob. End quote. This passage has caused a lot of confusion, as well as generated some interesting apologetics and analysis. Essentially, the greatest star nearest the throne of God is Kolob. As early as 1913, an article appeared attempting to pinpoint in the night sky where this throne might be. In an article contained in the 1913 edition of the Improvement Era, titled Joseph Smith Jr. as a Translator, written by Robert C. Webb, he articulated what Kolob could mean and where it might point. From 1913, quote, The explanation given in connection with this figure is that it indicates, quote, Kolob signifying the first creation nearest to the celestial, end quote. The form of this word would seem to suggest a Tamitic etymology, akin perhaps to the Hebrew word Kolob, a dog, whence possibly Sirius, the dog star, so called. According to the further explanation, it gives light to the sun and other bodies through the medium of 2-2 and 2-3, which are called collectively Hakaukobim. This curious word is also Hebrew. I'm sorry, everybody. Some of the words that Joseph came up with here, we're not going to read, even a majority of them, but they are fun and wacky. I would recommend going and listening to David Michael stumble through these on My Book of Mormon. He read through the Book of Abraham and the Pricey Pearl. I think it took him like 2 episodes to get through it. It's hilarious. So anyway, he goes on to say, Robert C. Webb goes on to say, this curious word is also Hebrew, although judging from the spelling, the pronunciation is expressed rather than the direct transliteration. It is the Hebrew kokob, a star, kokobim, stars, the syllable ha, presenting the definite article, whence, quote, the stars, end quote. So from Robert C. Webb here, we have the justification for labeling Kolob as the Sirius star, dog. It means dog, the Sirius dog star. And he claims that it has Hebrew words. Kolob has the Hebrew language of KLB. So there's actually an article published by the Rothberg International School of Hebrew University, and it's titled Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog, and it goes through the Semitic root of Kolob. But because Hebrew doesn't have any vowels, it's just KLB. So it could be Caleb, Keleb, or Kolob. And I think you're going to like this. This is this is a Hebrew scholar taking apart the ancient Hebrew of what KLB means. Quote, Keleb in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 19. The central locus of the discussion concerning the possibility that the word KLB may refer to something other than a canine is in Deuteronomy 23:19. Now quoting Deuteronomy, quote, You shall not bring the fee of a whore or the pay of a Keleb into the house of the Lord in fulfillment of any vow, for both are abhorrent to the Lord your God. End quote. Back to this Hebrew scholar. The ancient commentaries and translations understood the Hebrew word Keleb in its common meaning of dog. This remained the standard interpretation until the modern period. Since the 19th century, many biblical scholars have proposed that the term KLB be understood here referring to a male prostitute. End quote. A male prostitute, KLB. So let me just set the record straight here. To modern Hebrew scholars, one interpretation of the Book of Abraham passage about God living on the planet nearest the star Kolob here, modern Hebrew scholars would say that God and his harem of wives live on the planet nearest the star Manhor. I'm just going to let that stand on its own. Let it sink in a little bit. I love it so much. Anyway, the second part of that passage that we read talks about how many days on Kolob are reconciled with days on earth. So according to the book of Abraham, 1,000 years on earth is a single day on Kolob, which harkens to a passage in Genesis which articulates roughly the same concept. The passage following that articulates even deeper the concept of how larger planets have longer days than smaller planets in their respective revolutions. Quote, "And the Lord said unto me, the planet, which is the lesser light, lesser than that which is to rule the day, even the night, is above or greater than that upon which thou standest," meaning earth, "in the point of reckoning. For it moveth in order more slow. This is in order, because it standeth above the earth upon which thou standest. Therefore the reckoning of its time is not so many as to its number of days, and of months, and of years. And the Lord said unto me, Now, Abraham, these two facts exist. Behold, thine eyes seeth it. It is given unto thee to know the times of reckoning and the set times, yea, the set times of the earth upon which thou standest, and the set time of the greater light, which is set to rule the day, and the set time of the lesser light, which is set to rule the night." I know it's confusing. We're going to go through it. "Now the set time of the lesser light is longer time as to its reckoning than the reckoning of the time of the earth upon which thou standest. And where these two facts exist," there were apparently two facts baked in there, "there shall be another fact above them. That is, there shall be another planet whose reckoning of time shall be longer still. And thus there shall be a reckoning of the time of one planet above another until thou come nigh unto Kolob," man-whore, "which Kolob," man-whore, "is the after the reckoning of the Lord's time, which Kolob," man-whore, "is set nigh unto the throne of God to govern all those planets which belong to the same order of that upon which thou standest. And it is given unto thee to know the set time of all the stars that are set to give light until thou come near unto the throne of God." End quote. Okay, that was extremely confusing, but let me just walk through this a little bit here. Had the book of Abraham been truly written by Abraham, this would be a monumental piece of Mormon and Christian prophecy, if we are extremely generous with the interpretation, that is. Essentially, this was the astrological interpretation of Kepler's law of planetary motion. Bigger planets further from a star revolve and move slower than planets closer to a star. That's basically what this is saying. This is a messy way of saying it, and the passage could be interpreted multiple ways, but that's at least what I take away from it and the two facts, quote unquote, that are articulated in the passage. Now, if this was indeed written 3,500 years before Kepler was alive, as the book of Abraham claims to be, this would be a monumental chunk of prophetic scripture. But if we consider a number of markers in Joe's life, not least of which is the fact that he died with a Jupiter talisman on his person, we can see his affinity towards astrology, and this passage falls into the realm of astrological nonsense, which means a lot to those reading it who know the interpretation of all the words, but to outside readers like us, it just seems like brain vomit from Joseph Smith. Using the stars to divine the nature of God or gods, or the direction of the universe, that's astrology. It's been widely practiced endeavor through many human cultures. Astrology was one of Joe's many fascinations, and it's tied directly with many of the occult ceremonies and practices which Joe held a certain predilection for. You wonder why he saw the angel every September from 1823 to 1827. It's astrological. Now, I want to just dive a little bit down this rabbit hole here. Speculative Masons were often steeped in astrology, and many of the early astronomers themselves were Masons. Alchemy was another one of these schools of thought that was being passed around Masonic lodges. Astrology has often been called the daughter of astronomy, and likewise alchemy could also be called the daughter of chemistry. These are the speculative and conjectural nonsense fields of pseudoscience, which were often accompanied by the much harder descriptive and operative sciences, many of which were passed from generation to generation inside Masonic lodges. So Joe's affinity for Christian astrology likely honed upon his official induction into Masonry, and the years he'd spent cultivating this playground inside of his mind were likely shaped by his associates who practiced the occult and alchemy and astrology, and had garnered that intelligence from Masons while in lodge. That's just yet one more piece to the Masonry and Mormonism puzzle, which exhibits just how inextricably tied they are. So to wrap this back into astrology, specifically in the Book of Abraham, this book was written and published post-Copernicus, Kepler, and Newton. The so-called revelations in the Book of Abraham of planetary motion, often used in apologetic ways, I might add, speaks nothing to the actual astronomy, which had developed long before the birth of Joseph Smith, and it merely offers platitudinous astrology, which Agrippa rightly labeled as nothing more than entertainment when he wrote this passage around 1530 in his book The Vanity of Arts and Sciences. Quote, "Yet these fortune-tellers," referring to astrologers, "do find entertainment among princes and magistrates, from whom they receive considerable salaries. Whereas there is indeed no sort or generation of men more pernicious to a commonwealth than those that undertake to prognosticate by the stars, by dreams, or by other artifices of divination to scatter the prophecies about." End quote. Find entertainment in astrology and receive considerable salaries. I love that quote. Wise words spoken from the grave nearly half a millennium ago. Basically, the way that I interpret what Agrippa said about this in The Vanity of Arts and Sciences is astrology and alchemy paid the bills because it was the quackery that sold books, divining the future from these methods, while astronomy and chemistry were doing the real work behind the scenes, oftentimes being funded by astrology and alchemy. I'm sure we can see analogs of this same idea permeating our culture today. It's just somewhat heartening to know that 500 years ago, selling fake news has always paid better than selling facts. It's not just a recent trend. Chapter 3 finishes with God, Jehovah, showing more visions to Abraham with the following passage. Quote, "And the Lord said unto me, these two facts exist, that there are two spirits, one being more intelligent than the other, that there shall be another more intelligent than they. I am the Lord thy God. I am more intelligent than they all. The Lord thy God sent his angel to deliver thee from the hands of the priest of Elkanah. I dwell in the midst of them all. I now, therefore, have come down unto thee to declare unto thee the works which my hands have made, wherein my wisdom excelleth them all. For I rule in the heavens above and in the earth beneath, in all wisdom and prudence over all the intelligences thine eyes have seen from the beginning. I came down in the beginning in the midst of all the intelligences thou hast seen. Now the Lord had shown unto me, Abraham, the intelligences that were organized before the world was, and among all these were many of the noble and great ones. And God saw these souls that they were good, and he stood in the midst of them. And he said," these are all these pre-existent intelligences, these premortal spirits, basically, "These I will make my rulers. For he stood among those that were spirits, and he saw that they were good. And he said unto me, Abraham, thou art one of them. Thou wast chosen before thou wast born." Premortal existence. "And there stood one among them that was like unto God. And he said unto those who were with him, We will go down. We will go down. For there is space there, and we will take of these materials, and we will make an earth whereon these may dwell. And we will prove them herewith, to see if they will do all things whatsoever the Lord their God shall command them. And they who keep their first estate shall be added upon, and they who keep not their first estate shall not have glory in the same kingdom with those who keep their first estate. And they who keep their second estate shall have glory added upon their heads forever and ever." End quote. Okay, this is the introduction to the first and second estate doctrine. The idea of the angels who kept versus relinquished their first estate is in the New Testament, and this is in Jude chapter 1, verses 5 through 6. Quote, "I will therefore put you in remembrance, though ye once knew this, how that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed them that believed not. And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day." End quote. So one way to understand this estate doctrine is by using the term existence instead of estate. So Mormon doctrine teaches that we're all infinite spirits who are granted their first estate in the premortal existence, their first existence. Those who abandoned that first premortal estate, they left with the 1/3 of the hosts of heaven, and they went down to outer darkness with Lucifer. Those who retained their first estate are granted their second estate or existence when they are born on earth. So mortal existence is the second estate. or a spirit receives their second estate upon receiving their physical body and all of the opportunities for experience and development that mortality affords. This second estate doctrine is specific to Mormonism alone, and it's only provided in the Book of Abraham. You don't have the second estate doctrine without the Book of Abraham. So after the introduction of the first and second estate here, the Book of Abraham pays a very brief homage to the doctrinal treatise captured in the Book of Moses, published, 10 years prior to this. And that's also part of the Pearl of Great Price. This theological claim states that Jesus and Lucifer are the literal sons of Elohim, Heavenly Father, and they both proposed a plan to Heavenly Father. Jesus' plan was that of free and independent agency among the embodied spirit children of God in their second estate down on earth. Lucifer's plan, however, offered no agency, but merely made us all robots to execute the will of the Father, making us all essentially robots. But there wouldn't be any death or sickness or pain and suffering or any of that, and all of these spirits would return to the presence of God after the bodily death, after the end of their second estate. There wouldn't be any judgment, no separation of the kingdoms, nothing bad would ever happen. We'd all just be Adam and Eve's in an eternal Garden of Eden in Jackson County, Missouri. God chose Jesus' plan, and Lucifer was so upset with that decision that he departed heaven, bound for outer darkness, which is when 1/3 of the hosts of heaven departed along with Lucifer, thus abandoning their first estate. So this is really much deeper Mormon doctrine than we typically get into. We more focus on the history, not so much the doctrine, but there's a lot kind of wrapped up into this, and we can discuss this at a later time if needs be. So the passage that it talks about this plan in the Book of Abraham is as follows, quote, "And the Lord said, who shall I send?" Meaning, who shall I send to earth to form all of the intelligences and energy in the void? "And one answered like unto the Son of Man, Here am I, send me. And another answered and said, Here am I, send me. And the Lord said, I will send the first. And the second was angry, and kept not his first estate. And at that day many followed after him." End quote. So if you haven't ever read the Book of Moses, that passage does not make any sense. But if you understand the entire idea of the first, second estate of God's plan, of Jesus's plan, of Lucifer's plan, if you understand all of those, that passage can be put into context. Anyway, continuing on, there's an interesting shift once we get from chapter 3 to chapters 4 and 5. Everything in the Book of Abraham so far has been Abraham interacting with the world around him and the Lord his God. Singular, Lord God. Chapters 4 and 5, however, recount one of the Genesis creation narratives, but with every entry of God replaced with gods, plural. Now this is interesting for a few reasons. It wouldn't be until the King Follett Discourse that Joe publicly preached on basically the infinite regression of gods and the nature of Elohim God. But it was back in Liberty Jail in 1839 when he first used the word gods instead of God to describe his own personal notion of his personal creator God, or gods. One of his letters to the saints during their exodus to Illinois from Missouri said gods instead of God, which stands out prominently when compared to every other public sermon that Joseph ever gave. Now, I'm going to read this really quick here, but one possible reasoning through which to interpret this shift in terminology in Liberty Jail could be due to Joseph Smith's own self-reflection while he was locked up with nothing to do other than just think and write. God had forsaken his prophet servant and all the thousands of Mormons in their time of need. Joseph had given prophecy after prophecy that the Mormons would conquer their enemies and that he would be the next Muhammad of this generation. Yet there he was, locked in jail, while all of the Mormons suffered in sickness and death during the winter exodus to their next promised land in Illinois. Personally, I think that Joe felt abandoned by his God and was forced to truly ponder the existence of God in ways that he had never taken the time to do so before. Thus, the first invocation of gods instead of God. That's how I view this situation and the shift in 1839, but I don't really have any other marker or evidence other than just the actual timing and the language to substantiate it beyond a reasonable doubt. It's fairly speculative. And really, think about it, would that be surprising? A lot of people who believe in God ponder why bad things happen to them when they're at rock bottom. Joseph in Liberty Jail was at rock bottom. I mean, why would God let this happen to me? Of course, in Joe's case, why would God let these terrible things happen to his chosen saints and his chosen prophet servant? So Modern Day Doctrine and Covenants section 121 is one of Joseph's letters to the saints in Quincy, Illinois, that he sent from Liberty Jail. And it starts with this: O God, where art thou? And where is the pavilion that covereth thy hiding place? How long shall thy hand be stayed, and thine eye, yea, thy pure eye, behold from the eternal heavens the wrongs of thy people and of thy servants, and thine ear be penetrated with their cries? Yea, O Lord, how long shall they suffer these wrongs and unlawful oppressions, before thine heart shall be softened towards them, and thy bowels be moved with compassion towards them? Quite interesting. Does seem like Joseph is having a bit of an existential crisis here. It continues, At a time to come, in the which nothing shall be withheld, whether there be one God or many gods, they shall be manifest. All thrones and dominions, principalities and powers shall be revealed and set forth upon all those who have endured valiantly for the gospel of Jesus Christ. End quote. Whether there be one God or many gods. Didn't Joseph see God in the sacred grove? Whether there be one God or many gods. Quite interesting. Obviously, he was really struggling with what this meant. So when we move back onto the book of Abraham, it's essentially a revision of the Genesis narrative, with God being replaced by gods, plural. And it happened 3 years after this Liberty Jail letter, when it seems like Joe was at rock bottom and having some kind of major faith or existential crisis. Now, Joe had come a long way since he was locked up in jail. He'd gotten back up after falling down, and now, in Nauvoo, he had a whole new metropolis built as a monolith to the unwavering fealty the saints had sworn to their prophet. So let's read a quick snapshot of the book of Abraham compared to the Genesis creation myth. This is from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and earth. And the earth was without form and void, and the darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, Let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, and it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. End quote. So here is Joseph's revision of Genesis in Abraham chapter 4, verse 1. Quote, And then the Lord said, Let us go down. And they went down at the beginning, and they organized and formed, that is, the gods, the heavens and the earth. And when I said that is the gods, that's in parentheses in the actual writing, in the original 1842 edition. And the earth, after it was formed, was empty and desolate, because they had not formed anything but the earth, and darkness reigned upon the face of the deep, and the spirit of the gods was brooding upon the faces of the water. And they said, the gods, Let there be light, and there was light. And they, the gods, comprehended the light, for it was bright. And they divided the light, or caused it to be divided from the darkness. And the gods called the light day, and the darkness they called night. End quote. And it continues on like that for 2 chapters, rewriting the entire Genesis narrative from chapter 1. It's interesting to note, the book of Abraham actually ends with Eve being made from Adam's rib, and Adam naming all the creatures gods gave him dominion over. This leads one to believe that it was a work in progress and would be furthered at a later time. Now, at the beginning of this section of the book, it constructs facsimile 2 with the translation of its meaning below. So facsimile 2 is the circular sigil known to Egyptologists as a hypocephalus. This is the funerary permit for Horus Rey to be allowed into the afterlife, but Joseph applied it to the passages in the book of Abraham that we just read, rewriting the Genesis creation narrative, which comprise today's modern-day book of Abraham chapters 4 and 5. So Joe claimed that the hypocephalus depicted the following items. Number 1, Kolob, man whore, signifying the first creation nearest to the celestial or the residence of God. Number 2, stands next to Kolob, called by the Egyptians Oliblish. I know, it's Joseph's brain vomit, which is the next grand governing creations near to the celestial or the place where God resides. Number 3 is made to represent God sitting upon his throne, clothed with power and authority, with the crown of eternal light upon his head, representing also the grand key words of the holy priesthood as revealed to Adam in the Garden of Eden. And the number 4 answers to the Hebrew word Rao-Kiang, signifying expanse or the firmament of the heavens, also a numerical figure in Egyptian, signifying 1,000, answering to the measuring of the time of Oliblish, which is equal with Kolob in its revolution and in its measuring of time. And then it just continues on like that, naming all of these 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way through 21, and it terminates with figures 8 through 21, claiming that they'll be revealed at a later date. Kind of lazy, in my opinion. Now, the reason this is relevant is due to the placement of its printing and the text of the Book of Abraham, which follows after the printing. The rewritten creation myth is based on this facsimile, this hypocephalus, and Abraham teaching Pharaoh about astronomy is based on facsimile 3. And we'll discuss those in depth next episode. But due to the simple fact that these facsimiles were printed where they were and were quote-unquote translated according to Joe's translation method with the explanations which reflects the content in the Book of Abraham, this utterly eviscerates any claim that the Book of Abraham text was based on something other than the facsimiles. Now, we're going to discuss the apologist and Egyptologist claims next week, but it's important to note this crucial fact as we wrap up the discussion of the content of the Book of Abraham today, the spiritual aspect of it. These facsimiles served to be the inspiration for the content in the Book of Abraham. And we just read through and translated the quote-unquote facsimiles where Joseph's translation reflected the content in the actual written Book of Abraham. And we needn't appeal to the quote-unquote missing portions of the papyri collection to surmise where else that content could have come from. The factual claims against the Book of Abraham say nothing of its impact on Mormon doctrine and theology. Without the Book of Abraham, Mormonism doesn't have Kolob, or man-whore by modern Hebrew scholarship. It doesn't have the first and second estate doctrine. We don't have gods being the creators of earth. We don't have the sacrificial narrative of Abraham by the Egyptian idolatrous priest of Elkanah. We don't have God descending in the form of a great bird to rescue Abraham from his sacrificial predicament. We don't have the temple ceremony passion narrative of God commanding Jehovah to go down and create the earth in a 7-day period. Nor do we have our spirits being called intelligences that are organized in the first estate before we're physically born into our second estate. And we don't have the further retrenchment of the teaching that dark skin is the mark or curse of Cain, and white skin is associated with righteousness. The Book of Abraham creates all of this in Mormon doctrine. It's so crucial to deep Mormon theology, and to abandon it would excise so many beliefs that it would render Mormon doctrine fundamentally different. Even the study guide that I found on the LDS.org teaching manual site, it spent the first 15 paragraphs defending the authenticity of the papyri and the quote-unquote translation method that Joe used to bring the Book of Abraham into existence. The fact of the matter is, Joe's theology mutated in extreme ways during the Nauvoo period, and the Book of Abraham is yet one more marker of that continued evolution. When we start plucking some of Joe's teachings out of modern-day Mormonism, one wonders where we should stop removing pieces and patching over them. Should the church do something more than just disavow old racist teachings? Should they say the Book of Abraham was a creation solely of Joseph Smith and not actually written in the hand of Abraham as Joe claimed it was? Should the church abandon the idea of Kolob and God being a human being who was once mortal just like we are today? If we pluck out too many of these pieces, Joe ceases to be the prophet the church claims him to be today. If the church can disavow or abandon some of Joe's teachings, why not more? Why not all of them? Why even need Joseph Smith for anything other than the demonstrably fallacious Book of Mormon? The way I see it, just reading through the Book of Abraham, the church is trapped. They can't get rid of any of the Book of Abraham without getting rid of major pieces which set Mormon doctrine apart from all other mainstream Protestant Christian sects. Now they're in a sunk cost fallacy with these doctrines, seemingly hoping that one day it will all make sense and people will stop abandoning the church because of its false claims and teachings. One day, if they just withstand the bleeding for long enough, Jesus will return and every piece of Mormon scripture and doctrine will make sense to everybody in the world. The rapture will happen. Mormonism will finally be proven to be the one true religion if they can just stand up to or wholly ignore criticism from the outside world filled with natural men who are enemies of God and have been from the fall of Adam. I'm of the opinion that a major reformation needs to happen within the church, and it needs to be top down. Any bottom-up reformation will result in schism and break-off faction creation. This needs to be a top-down restructuring of doctrine, theology, practice, and membership requirements. The church needs to rip off this Band-Aid already so it can properly clean and dress the wounds and heal without the infection plaguing the next patchwork bandage that they put in place. I don't reasonably see this happening anytime in the near future. This is a pipe dream. But every day they stick to their guns when it comes to the Book of Abraham or any race issues or polygamy doctrine or the Book of Mormon alone, just the Book of Mormon. Every day the church sticks its guns is another disaffected member, another person hurt by institutionalized racism and misogyny, and another family who finally says they're done with the church and sends in their resignation letters. Every day that passes without fundamental issues being addressed and immoral doctrines being exorcised and apologized for is another tithing envelope left empty. This train wreck may be fun to watch, fantasizing about how it ends, but the damage and pain this wreck is causing every day is objectively immoral and disgusting when we see our fellow human beings suffer through it every single day, regardless of their beliefs. Maybe it would be best to advocate for understanding and sympathy in this regard. The church and its leadership are stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to the majority of doctrinal issues. Members are stuck with either consuming anti-Mormon literature and abandoning their exaltation in eternal glory, or just burying their heads in the sand and acknowledging that there may be problems, but the church is so good and helps so many people, so I'm just going to follow it. Ex-Mormons are stuck with friends and family members believing in a racist, misogynistic, and damaging cult, but they can't talk to their friends and family about it because it just causes fights. This religion is a dividing force amidst an already divided species of animals that we call human beings. This religion shoves a wedge between people in all sorts of relationships and causes more heartbreak and depression than it can offer through meaningless platitudes about what happens when we die. This religion takes money from poor and funds billion-dollar for-profit business endeavors, while people all over the world thirst and starve to death and never get treated for common illnesses. This religion is a malignant parasite and impacts everybody differently on a personal level, yet causes the same anger and pain for so many people in and out of it. Everybody is a victim of this religion, even those at the very top who have no easy way out of these problematic issues without losing face. The leadership doesn't want to feel like they've misled people, and the members don't want to feel like they've been misled. But the church's doctrines, theology, and scripture are leading everybody astray and causing people to lose sight of truly important issues facing humanity. The institution of Mormonism needs to humble itself and reform, or the hemorrhaging will only get worse as access to information worldwide increases. So, keep an eye out for the slow and morbid collapse of Talos at some indeterminable point in our future. Lesley Butterfield is a registered nurse and survivor advocate who works with victims of abuse across a variety of settings. She helped contribute to coverage surrounding abuse in several news and media outlets, including BuzzFeed, Good for Utah, the Salt Lake Tribune, the New Yorker, and Vox. She's also appeared as a guest on Mormon Happy Hour and Rational Faiths podcasts, speaking on women's issues, spiritual abuse, and the cultural mechanisms which enable abuse within the Mormon context. Recently, her op-ed entitled Open Letter to the LDS Patriarchy was published in the Salt Lake Tribune, which garnered national attention. She's also spoken to the state legislature as part of her advocacy efforts. She also serves on her local Special Education Advisory Committee and is a member of the Attachment and Trauma Network, the National Organization of Victim Assistance, Break the Silence, National Alliance on Mental Illness, Mental Health America, and American Alliance of University Women. And if that wasn't enough, she is also the creator of unrighteousdominion.org, which is a platform for survivors of spiritual abuse within the Mormon Church to safely and anonymously share their stories. Lesley, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I want to start off with a quick question. And this is possibly the most important question of our conversation, so let's get it out of the way at the very onset. With all the advocacy and the network you do, how do you find time to eat or sleep or go for nice walks through the forest or anything?
Well, it's a challenge sometimes. And sometimes I do have to step back and say, I need some self-care today, and I can't do, I can't do some of my usual work. But it is a challenge, but the self-care part is very, very important. And I set those boundaries and I stick to them. So, listen to yourself, listen to your body. And ultimately that kind of helps you keep going in the long run.
I mean, it must be a tireless endeavor doing all that you do. It's just absolutely astonishing. So I want to dive into this, and I think it's important to kind of level the playing field for the purposes of this conversation, so we can all kind of work with the same definition of what it is that you work with, and that is abuse. It's a broad term, but can you just define that for us, and set the boundaries for us so we can kind of work with a definition for this conversation?
Sure. So abuse really is using a treatment or mechanisms or exerting control when a person is in a position of power, and exerting control over another person for a bad purpose or a misuse, basically. Specifically, spiritual abuse is one that may not be well known right now, but it is kind of the awareness is increasing around it. And spiritual abuse really goes to who a person is and what a person is and how a person is and why a person is. So it's the very existing of your being, which in my opinion makes it extremely damaging when it does happen to a person.
I want to try and tease this apart a little bit, because the term spiritual can have an effect of turning a lot of people off of this. I mean, obviously that is an extremely loaded term. I wonder, is there a way that we can parse out spiritual abuse to being that of emotional and mental abuse kind of cobbled together? Or is there a better way that we could possibly use spiritual abuse, or maybe work with another definition that helps to bolster what you mean by spiritual abuse?
Yes, definitely. I think that a lot of times we hear spiritual abuse in conjunction with religious abuse and secular belief abuse, or church abuse. And sometimes that can be appropriate, but sometimes I don't think that is very helpful, because like you said, spiritual abuse really can consist of emotional abuse, verbal abuse, psychological abuse, mental abuse, even physical and sexual abuse. It really goes to a person's core. And when they're abused in those other ways, it is, in my opinion, indicative of spiritual abuse, because you are exerting a force over them, or, in a position of power over them, to where they feel damaged to their core being, where they question their core being of who they are, and even their existence in itself.
So I want to dive into that a little bit as well, because there is a lot of mechanisms that go into this, and the way that I have heard this essentially parsed out is there's the overt abuse that can happen within the church, and that can be, of a physical or a sexual nature. And I'm applying this to the church specifically for myriad reasons. I mean, this is a podcast about the Mormon religion, and, that is primarily, it seems to be the field that you work in. But I also want to dive into what it seems like you work with much more, and that is the covert kind of abuse, where the abuse may not be so prevalent, and the people who are the victims of it may not even recognize that it is happening until damage has already been done. And, many years down the road, they realize, oh, I have some demons that I need to exorcise from the darker recesses of my mind. So what are some of those mechanisms that this covert kind of abuse does play into our day-to-day life as, if for members of the church?
Right. Yeah, I'm glad that you asked this. Actually, I was just working on kind of teasing out some of those mechanisms within the church. Within society, we've identified some of those mechanisms that why abuse is happening, or why it's enabled and thriving in many cases. But within the church, we have some, deeper and more definitive mechanisms, I think, at play. I have kind of characterized like 3 different spheres. So there's like the doctrinal sphere, the cultural sphere, and the institutional sphere. And each of those have mechanisms at play that sort of enable abuse to exist. And like I said, in many cases, thrive and just keep growing. Doctrinal, to take some in the doctrinal section, like we have stressing forgiveness of abuse, of any abuse that a survivor has endured. Oftentimes they're, kind of counseled to forgive, and that may be even more stressed than emphasizing restitution or accountability or even remorse from the abuser themselves. We have, the belief that kind of anger is evil or contention is of the devil. And so we don't want to identify those feelings or embrace those feelings. And if we do feel that, we can feel shame because of our doctrinal beliefs that those things are bad. And then we also have the kind of the purity teachings and the modesty, the modesty teachings
right,
of
worthiness
the girls.
Of everything. Yep.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So I think those are kind of, coupled into the doctrinal sphere. And then when you move on to the cultural sphere, we have kind of the unwritten rules, I'd say. So things that fall under that umbrella would be like seeing your bishop if you're having issues in your marriage or in any relationship, and it might be abuse. It might be abuse. It might be covert abuse. You might not know what's going on, but you want, something, is wrong and you want to talk to your bishop about it. That's kind of like the first line of defense, I guess, of who we would go to. We as Mormons kind of believe that our bishop is there to help us, and we don't ever think that maybe we should go to a therapist or the police instead of our bishop, at least at first. And along with the cultural sphere, there's kind of the, don't question or doubt the priesthood, and that kind of extends into the leaders and the policies and even the truth claims, I think. And then we also have like the social pressure to appear perfect and appear happy. And, certainly that plays into, not wanting to fully claim or own maybe what is happening in our own life. And then finally, the institutional sphere, we have things like the legal processes at work behind the scenes within the church, within the institution itself. And I would extend this to kind of the BYU situation, the Title IX funding there, and also the police organization, it being private or, thought to be kind of a private entity, not a government entity, and subject to different rules and things like that.
So obviously there's a lot to parse out of everything that you just said, and I want to kind of get to what I see as a fundamental issue when it comes to this, and that is how an abusive system is baked into the religion of Mormonism itself. So what I mean by that is, when there's a certain hierarchy that holds spiritual exaltation and reaching the celestial kingdom, that's always the end goal, and the hierarchy does kind of hold that in their control. They are the ones determining who is and is not worthy of achieving these end goals. A lot of mechanisms can be put into place consciously or even subconsciously by the religion itself in order to coerce the members into abusing each other and abusing themselves. So let me just ask kind of bluntly, how much do you think that the abuse that you work with is simply the product of it being a religious structure, and can a religion exist without some level of abuse like this?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, and I've thought a lot about that as I read survivor stories and I talk to people about their experiences. Some of it, of course, is the product of the system and the patriarchy, I think. And particularly when we see cases of like relational aggression or tribal shaming or social abuse. kind of situations where, someone experiences abuse and people in their ward kind of stop talking to them. I don't know. I can't say that is like a mechanism that the Mormon Church has put in place. Obviously, I don't think that is officially, but it is definitely a product of the people, I think, in the church as a whole. And I very much hesitate saying that because obviously not everybody shuns everybody, but that is something that it is a story I hear over and over again, is that people distance themselves when a person comes out and talks about something uncomfortable that they've experienced, like abuse. Some of the underpinnings of that, I feel like, are a lack of authenticity that, we've embraced in the church, and maybe not even knowingly. I don't think that we purposely go to church and say, I'm going to not be authentic today, but that is what's happening in a lot of places. We're not encouraged to share difficulties if it doesn't result in a happy ending,
Of course.
Yeah.
It's always supposed to be a testimony building experience if you're having troubles with your testimony or with your faith transition or whatever the case may be. Yeah.
Exactly.
How much of that is the culture versus the religion itself and the controlling mechanisms that are put in place by the religion? Or can those two even be, are they so inextricably tied that they can't be removed from each other?
Yeah, I mean, kind of exploring these mechanisms and putting them into the boxes that I have in the spheres, like I sort of come to realize that there is so much overlapping. I mean, to give you an example, there's, let's say, cultural. So patriarchy, I would put in the institutional sphere, but it's also very much cultural. That system of patriarchy in the institution has informed our cultural attitudes. And I feel like it also overlaps into the doctrinal sphere because it could be argued that there's doctrinal basis for patriarchy to be enveloped by the church. So yeah, I feel like everything is sort of inextricably linked, and it's rather impossible to take one part out without everything else kind of shuffling and making a domino effect, and kind of having to be rearranged or reorganized in a way, which I think, or I suspect, is maybe some of the difficulties that the church has in really addressing abuse.
Yeah, it's from the foundation. There has been this cancerous spot of doctrine within the church's original scripture and canon. And if you try and distance yourself from, if the church tries itself to distance itself from its doctrine, its scripture, and its past, at what point do you start extracting or removing yourself from these pieces that the church becomes unrecognizable from its past and its history? Maybe that's a positive step, though, right? I mean, maybe we should explore that. Maybe there needs to be some kind of massive Mormon reformation that happens. It's happened periodically at times within the LDS Church, within our LDS Church when it became the Community of Christ. This has happened a few times where they go through a major revamp and repackage so much and recanonize or decanonize some of the scripture. And it seems like that has a cleansing and purging effect of some of these, we can say, of some of the racism and some of the misogyny and some of the other negative impacts that the scripture itself, tends to cling to. But I mean, I don't know, what, in your opinion, do you think that's something that could be even feasible for the church to do? Have some kind of massive reformation that, it just tries to exercise all of these darker parts of its doctrine?
It's very hard for me to imagine that as a reality. I'm very hopeful.
That was very well articulated. Nicely said.
I'm very hopeful, that women can be ordained and that we can disavow polygamy and that we can disavow harmful doctrine and that, somebody from the pulpit at some point will say, Mormon doctrines should never be read again or quoted from in any congregation across the world.
Wow.
I would love for things like that to happen. But the more that I delve into the issues and the more that I know about particularly the institution of the church and the interworkings of it, and kind of how what I know about how things are run and what I've been told about kind of how things are run, the more pessimistic I get about something like that happening.
Wow. Okay. I have to say, I kind of share in your pessimism, and I'd like to dive into that in a few minutes here. But first, I want to broach the McKenna-Denson subject, and I think this kind of dovetails off of what you were just saying, because the rape allegations surrounding what happened with McKenna-Denson and Joseph Bishop, this is an ongoing issue within the church, and it has been interesting because I think there has been a lot revealed about the way that the church treats issues of abuse and the way that it has possibly, there have been markers within Denson's case that have possibly revealed the way that the church has treated these issues in the past as well. So what are kind of some of your takeaways from the Denson case and from everything that's recently been revealed since March of 2018?
Yeah, so definitely I feel like McKenna really tried to follow the unwritten reporting procedure that we have in the church of how to report abuse if it is your leader. She tried to go to a different leader. She tried to go up the chain of command. She tried to talk to a general authority. She tried to talk to several bishops. She tried to call church headquarters. She tried to do all of these things, and her trust, was just put in to the leaders that she was reporting it to for them to take care of it. And that was not misplaced trust, because that is what we are told. We really are hopeful, and we're told that these are good men and they will take care of it, because why would anyone cover it up? That's unimaginable, right?
Of course.
But when we see this happen, and hers isn't the only case I think that this has happened in, but we see that as it's reported, we are expected to drop it after we report abuse by a leader, and we're expected to put our trust that the chain of command, can kind of take care of it, and everyone can do what's right, because that's a doctrine that, we are taught. But it's really very rarely the case, I would say. I don't know if I would say very rarely. In the situations that I have read about where there has been no real accountability, especially for higher leaders, that is typically what survivors will share with me, is that their distress in reporting, and all the while being traumatized with having to report their story over and over again, and then being re-victimized by the church really not taking care of it in a responsible, healthy way.
This is obviously a tough conversation to have, particularly with members, family members, coworkers, friends who are members, especially if this happens across the believing divide. How do we bridge this chasm? I mean, you're somebody who's been working in this field of abuse for years now. You've contributed so much to this conversation. Do you have some pointers that you can provide, some little morsels you can give to us to help start these conversations about abuse within the church? And I mean, really, it's not just the LDS Church, but other faith traditions. When those opportunities come up, how do we broach this subject?
Yeah, I think you made a great point. It is other faith traditions, and it's society, and it's in workplaces, and it's in families. And a lot of people will say that to me in my advocacy effort when I say I'm, gathering stories of spiritual abuse within the Mormon church. Some people will say, why this happens everywhere? Why are you just focused on the Mormon church? And then they'll kind of make a segue into, I'm trying to take the church down or something. And, in reality, the Mormon church is what I know. And
Yeah.
I don't know anything about the Catholic. I wasn't raised Catholic. I wasn't raised Protestant. I wasn't raised in these other faiths. And there's a piece of my heart within the Mormon Church, that I wanted to be safe. I would love for it to be safe for me, for my children. I would love to feel like I could attend church and have it be a healthy place, and a place that we all have an idea that church should be like. So that kind of focuses my efforts. But sorry, can you repeat your question?
Well, no, I think you answered it quite well. I mean, obviously the problem is it's such a massive issue. And when somebody does, reply with, well, why are you doing this? Are you just attacking the church? It's like, well, if I broaden my scope any further beyond something that I know and I'm familiar with, then you lose effectiveness quickly. It has an inverse relationship.
Right.
So I guess maybe give us some pointers of how we can start that conversation, and as well as maybe, dovetailing off of that as well, what are some common mistakes that people make, buzzwords that people will say that can throw up these walls in conversations. These are crucial and often polarizing issues. These conversations need to happen. What should we avoid and what should we try and talk about?
Yeah, so this has definitely been a learning experience for me. When I post the advocacy work that I'm doing and ask, if there's anyone that feels like they want to share their story safely and anonymously in different groups, or, I talk to people about it, I've learned that there are a few things to do and not to do. The first thing definitely is, depending on the group that I'm speaking to, I will claim my membership, and I'm still a member on the books. I don't talk about my activity level or my personal belief level right now, but I do claim my membership and I say I'm a member of the church. And oftentimes, if it's a group of believing Mormons, they are very, very, very concerned about that status. Before they even talk to me, they want to know if I'm a member, first of all.
Oh, that I found a lot of utility in the term secular Mormon for that very reason. Yeah.
Right. So, and I feel like that's helpful. If that helps them to feel safe and helps them feel like I can honor their story and their pain and they can trust me with that, I think that is a starting point, a starting point of trust. I'm honest in the fact that, am honest and will share that I've identified issues that I feel like enable abuse within the church. Now, for some people, for some believing Mormons, I feel like that is kind of an automatic disqualification for me. And even in some groups, it's like just posting my website and saying, hey, I'm a Mormon. I'm looking for other Mormons. If you want to share your story, I'd love, for you to do this on this platform. But oftentimes, I guess sometimes I should say, they will look at the site and think that it is an apostate effort to make the church look bad.
Of course.
And to me, I will patiently try to explain in the best way that I can that making the church look bad and bringing to light the issues of abuse within the church are two separate issues. They're not, that's not my aim, is to make the church look bad. But my aim is to bring to light the abuse in the church because it's happening whether or not we choose to look at it or not.
Lesley, I really want to thank you so much for joining us for this important subject, and it affects millions of people. This is something that conversations that need to happen. I want to give you a chance to talk about unrighteousdominion.org and any other projects you're currently working on. And can you tell us about that? And also, can you let people know where to find your online presence?
Sure. So unrighteousdominion.org is the website, and it is a site that was created really for the sole purpose of having a safe and anonymous platform for survivors of spiritual abuse within the Mormon Church to safely share their stories. That is really the aim of it, and you can go on there and read the stories. We don't allow comments. We don't allow it to be shared, individual stories to be shared online. Obviously, you can link to the site. And so that is the main purpose of the advocacy work there. That has kind of grown into discovering some of the more sinister problems, I think, within the church. And sometimes I'll get some documents or some more inflammatory stories that are a little bit more difficult to just post online. And so, it's very clear to me that there is a need for something like this. And I would love for the church to get behind something like this, have a victim hotline, where people could call in and safely and anonymously or safely report at least abuse by a church leader, spiritual abuse, or, anything of that nature, really. So that's the website, unrighteousdominion.org. I'm also on Facebook. Unrighteous Dominion has a Facebook page, facebook.com/stopunrighteousdominion. And the direct email address is stopunrighteousdominion@gmail.com.
Fantastic. Lesley, do you have any concluding thoughts or anything that you'd like to leave us with in light of our discussion today?
Yeah, I'm happy to be able to talk to you about the issue of spiritual abuse within the church. And, I just to give a challenge to everybody, I don't want to sound trite or anything, but, the statistics are that we know people that have experienced abuse. And when I say abuse, I'm talking about the overt abuse. So physical abuse, sexual abuse, things of that nature. And if those are the statistics, that means that we can be a point of contact and a safe person for a victim who needs that, who needs a safe person. Because so often, if they go to their bishop, they're re-traumatized, re-victimized, sometimes even re-abused. And that is a huge concern of mine and something I'm working very hard, to address and bring to light and stop from happening. Because it's a long journey and a very damaging journey psychologically and spiritually to have to go through that situation. So I offer everyone a challenge, inform yourself on abuse. There is so much information out there, and, post on your Facebook page, say that you are a safe person if anyone needs to come to you. Know the community resources that are out there. That's something also that I really, really challenge the church to do, is to kind of embrace and refer out to those community resources when a victim discloses abuse. And so, yeah, I would love for everybody to start doing those kind of things and make it a healthier place, and make yourself a safe person for somebody to reach out to.
Lesley Butterfield, thank you again so much for joining us. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, that's going to do it for our episode today. If you are a supporter on patreon.com/nakedmormonism, I would recommend listening to this episode on the Patreon feed, because there was a whole separate segment of the conversation that I had with Lesley. We dove down some other rabbit holes and explored a bit of her own personal story and spoke for quite a bit longer. It's about twice the length of the regular segment. So I'd recommend giving that a listen. If you are not already listening to the Patreon feed, if you're a Patreon supporter, check it out over there. You can punch the URL for the Patreon-only feed into your favorite podcatcher of choice and download the episodes as they come out on the Patreon feed, just like you would the regular feed. It'll just ask you to log in with your Patreon account. So just want to let everybody know there's a bunch of extra content over on patreon.com/nakedmormonism, and thank you all of the people who do support. Just like the newest supporters that we have Ryan, Ricky, and Shane, as well as Catherine. So those are our newest patrons. Thank you all so very much for pledging to support. Also, wanted to just quickly mention, Shane actually sent in an email. They looked at their Patreon account, understanding that they had pledged to support their show a long time ago, but when they looked at their account, it showed that they weren't supporting anybody. So the person sent an email saying that they were not sure exactly what happened to their Patreon account, but that they didn't take any actions, but somehow Patreon had stopped their pledges at some point. So if you are, if you believe that you are a supporter of the show and it, for some reason, it is not showing up that you're able to download the Patreon episodes, I would recommend just looking into your Patreon account and then, just check up on it, see if that is still working out the way that you plan on it and you're pledging the correct dollar amount. So once again, thank you to all the people who do support the show. And of course, thank you so much to all of the listeners who listen every single week and hit that download. You guys are so awesome. I really appreciate it. You are funding this investigative journalism and you're supporting it just by clicking the download button. So thank you, and I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Natalie Newell as production assistant, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres as legal counsel. Music is provided by Jason Comeau of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.